welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Brumlve, and I am happy to welcome in Martin Lew. He is the CEO over at Commtrex, and we're going to be talking about the future of rail logistics. So Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Blythe. I appreciate you having me on your show.
Absolutely. So for folks who may not be familiar with you and your career background, you used to work at JP Morgan as a commodity trader, which I think is super fascinating. So you kind of give us I guess a peek behind the curtain of your career background.
Absolutely, would love to do that. So I was at Bear Stearns initially, and Bear Stearns, the financial crisis happened in '08, and JP Morgan ended up acquiring Bear Stearns. And there were two organizations within Bear that were really interesting to JP Morgan. There was the Prime Brokerage Unit and then the Global Commodities Group. And I was on the Global Commodities sort of side of the house, and I was specifically on the coal and environmental markets trading desk. So two responsibilities, effectively, it was trading physical and financial coal. So think all the coal producers, utilities that burn coal, they need to commodity-linked financing to be able to finance their mines or finance their power plants. And then on the other side of the house, I was the lead originator for environmental markets. So I was the person that was talking to, at the time in the 2010-11 frame, I was talking to utilities and other emitters or other electric utilities about the cap and trade program, how to sort of mitigate the potential risk with cap and trade, and renewable energy credits. So funny enough, fast forward today, coal was very hot at the time, and now coal is sort of on its way down. Just coal retirement plants have been, things have been happening for quite a while. Now environmental markets via ESG has become something that's been very important. And how I got to where I am today is, in 2014, I saw that there was a real sort of inefficiency and void within the railroad industry. I was a shipper. We were moving 5 to 7 million tons a year. And what happened was every time I would want to work on was looking at a deal, and timing was of the essence, we needed to find a rail car capacity, transit capacity. We needed rates to be able to piece together delivered costs for our deals. And it always took a long time to be able to get all those data points. And I was sitting at one of the world's largest banks, and you would think I would have quick access to that information, but there was no index for rail cars. There's no index for freight rates. So there was no visibility like there is in trucking with load boards, or there's no visibility like there is in ocean freight. So because rail was such a opaque market, I thought at the time that somebody's going to create a digital ecosystem that takes the supply and demand side of the industry and puts them into one digital platform. Because a core part of our investment thesis at the time was by 2020, 50% of the workforce will be millennials, and by 2025, 75% will be millennials. And so at the time, as you're looking at where the puck is going, you're thinking to yourself, if that is the case and millennials are moving into these roles, there has to be a centralized repository or database that houses all this information, that has all rail-served warehouses, terminals, ports, short lines, all within one database, in one system, so that it's no different than in your personal life going to Expedia or Priceline to be able to find a hotel and then a rental car. That should all be done within one system. So at the time, nothing existed of the sort. So I took the leap off of faith to go start a company. And really, the very first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to create a leasing marketplace and a storage marketplace. So in a bull market, when rail was really hot, people would need to lease rail cars. But in a bear market, like when COVID happened, everything shut down, everyone's storing rail cars. So we started with those two marketplaces. Then we launched a buy-sell marketplace because there were a lot of rail cars that are being retired. So people were scrapping rail cars through our system. And then we launched the transloading marketplace about 3 years ago, which happened to be perfect timing because right before COVID, transloading was obviously a very important component of the supply chain, but it's kind of an underbelly of the supply chain. Not everyone is aware of transloading. So once COVID hit and people couldn't get their freight through, your LAX, Long Beach, your Seattle, Tacoma, through your Houston ports, everyone was looking for other ways to be able to move freight inland. And transloading is the mechanism to do that. So that's when our platform really sort of blew up, is because everybody was looking to transload, and we happen to have the only marketplace in US, Canada, and Mexico for transloading.
That's insane to me that a marketplace did not exist yet until just a few years ago. Why do you think that that just, I guess, it feels like modern technology that should have already been here. Why do you think that that didn't exist prior? Is it maybe just because rail itself has just been a mode of transportation that's been around for so long?
I think there's a few reasons. I think probably the most important reason, and this is probably similar in other industries, but rail is a very relationship driven business.
Hmm.
And the folks that manage the rail fleets on the shipper side, so that's when I refer to the demand side in our platform are the shippers, the 3PLs, the brokers that are actually looking for supply capacity. So on the demand side, um, rail is typically insourced, meaning there are in-house rail logistic groups for your major shippers. And those folks that are managing those groups have been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years. And they have relationships, and they have the people that they know. So there wasn't this real sort of need as far as the mid-sized to bigger shippers concerned. The small shippers, there's always been a need, but nobody has tried to jump into this space and really sort of fill that void and really sort of effectively try to match up the supply and demand through a digital ecosystem. So that's one. Number two is technology. I mean, at the end of the day, I started this business and launched the platform in 2017, and just like Uber and all the other sort of apps, cloud technology really didn't start taking off until sort of 2010, 11, 12, and really you needed that sort of cloud-based technology for a marketplace like us to really work. So that's number two. And then number three, and this is something that I did at the very beginning of the journey, is I went to 7 of the largest shippers and talked to them and had kind of a focus group with them and asked each of them, if we were to create this marketplace where you can go into a system and electronically connect with a short line railroad, a class 1 railroad, a translator, a lessor, would you use the system? And all 7 of them, 100% across the board, said no, they would never use the marketplace. And these are some of the largest shippers that I was speaking with, people that are moving significant volumes. And so most people would think, just on its face, if 7 shippers told you they would never use your marketplace, why would you go raise capital and continue to go do something when people are telling you they would never use it? The follow-up question that I would ask is, how much longer do you think you'll be managing the group and continue to be in rail logistics? And clear across the board, for all 7 of them, it was no more than 5 years from 2017. So that was the answer that I was looking for, was what's going to be the succession plan, or what's going to change in the future when the people with all the knowledge that have this, knowledge all in their brain and in their head and have the context, when they leave those seats and you have the next generation coming into the seats, the next generation coming to the seats, how are they going to be able to ramp up and get the knowledge and leverage those relationships? Because it's not just going to happen on the demand side, it's going to happen on the supply side. And at some point, the industry is going to have a whole new set of fresh faces that know nothing about rail if electronic or a database or repository isn't created, so that you don't need to know about rail if you want to source cars or source storage or source transloading. You can come into our platform and you can learn. We have these 101s that teach you all about things about rail, sponsored by folks like CSX and KCS, Gallagher on insurance. But the old thing is, I knew that the puck was going to go somewhere where you needed to have a standalone digital ecosystem that can be training wheels for anybody who's trying to move freight by rail, and you don't have to be an expert. And moving rail has historically been something that has really been relied upon by people who have a deep industry knowledge.
I love that aspect, because we were talking before we started recording about, who is really the audience of Everything is Logistics, and, who are we really speaking to? And I was trying to explain that, like, look, I come from a truckload background, and I know a little bit about rail, but a lot of my questions are going to probably sound like very entry level, because at the 3PLs or the 4PLs that I worked at, intermodal was always kind of like the back office guys, that the people in the back of the building, that the LTL and the expedited teams and the full truckload, they never talked to the intermodal guys. They just operated out on an island. So I admittedly don't know as much as I should about rail. So that's what this conversation is really going to be about, is just exploring the intricacies of this silo within transportation. And you had mentioned something earlier about asking 7 different shippers about what they wanted. And I thought that was interesting, because I think it's that Henry Ford quote, back in the day, if I were to ask, people what they wanted, they would have said more horses, not actual car. And so I think Yeah, so I think from that lens of being able to look into the future of what's going on within this industry, I think we got to kind of maybe take a step back for a second, because from an overall perspective, what kind of freight is shipped on rail? Is it, obviously, you had mentioned you were a coal trader with JP Morgan, but what other kinds of commodities are shipped using rail?
So when you think about rail, and this is probably not something that's very obvious to people, but there's two sides to rail. There's the carload side of the business, which is think your commodities, your raw goods, your materials, think inputs into production of different goods. So think steel, chemicals, plastics, lumber. Of all those different products on the carload side of the business, coal has historically been the largest by volume product that was moving on
Hmm.
rail. And so because of that, I had a lot of exposure to it, and that's where I saw a lot of the inefficiencies. Now, when you think about the other side of the business, which is the intermodal side, which you were referring to earlier, that's the other side of the business, which I think historically as well has primarily been controlled by IMCs.
Hmm.
And IMCs are kind of the conduit or the third party mechanism for a lot of the shippers to be able to use to be able to manage their freight that's moving via intermodal in containers. But when you think about rail, those are really two different animals, because on the carload side of the business, which you need what the term is for identifying specific types of goods is called a stick code. So the stick code, there's over 10,000 stick codes that move by rail. So think about that. There's over 10,000 stick codes on the carload side of the business, and there's really only a few different sizes of containers on the intermodal side. Intermodal, very fungible, right? There's really only a few containers that you have to really be concerned about moving, and it's very scalable because of the fungibility. On the carload side, a lot more technical requirements are needed. You have to have special types of tank cars or hoppers or gondolas. You need to have special type of equipment to unload the product. Whether it be a liquid product, a hazardous liquid product, a gas, or be an actual physical product such as coal or steel. And the reason why coal historically hasn't had, kind of IMCs on the carload side is because it's not very scalable like it is with containers, where there's just a few standardized sizes, and those sizes move on a certain type of trucks and then get drayed and then move final mile. This is very different because whether at the very beginning of the journey, which is, we call it at the coal mine or at the sawmill, to the very end of the journey, these carload products that are moving are very specialized and take typically specialized handling requirements to be able to manage those products. So when you think about the business, those are the two sides of the business. There's 1.6 million rail cars in North America, and it's about half and half. So about half of them are allocated to the carload side, and half are allocated to the intermodal side of the business.
At all this time, I'm gonna sound like an idiot just by saying this, but anytime I heard somebody mention carload when it refers to intermodal, I literally thought that they were just hauling cars. And I know that that probably sounds so dumb to the listeners out there who are experienced in rail, but like I said, this is a conversation around curiosity, so we are going to explore
Oh yeah,
these
yeah, no,
topics.
the rudimentary questions are great. I mean, I would love nothing more than if everyone was educated about rail.
And so, okay, so we know around the two different types. You have the intermodal side of things, and then you have the carload side of things. For if I understood you correctly. Now, where does rail sort of play a role in sort of the coast? Because from what I understand, a lot of the freight comes in through the ships, through the ports, and then I would assume get hauled on a truck or drayed, or and then it gets to different rail lines, and that supplies the majority of the middle of the country transportation. Is that a safe assumption, or is that
Yeah,
completely wrong?
yeah, no, no, that's it's on the intermodal side. You're absolutely right. So all the containers that are coming in from Asia or Europe, they're transloaded and then drayed and then either put on an intermodal flat car or they're put on truck to get to that final destination. Um, the carload side of the business isn't as fluid as that
Mm.
because there are so many different types of commodities that are moving on rail. And typically most of the products that are moving on rail are coming from somewhere within North America. They're coming from a coal mine, a steel plant. It's coming from a lumber facility within the U.S. So anytime you're looking at a move that's, call it 500, 600 miles plus, now rail is very competitive against truck. It takes 4 trucks for every 1 carload. That's the ratio, 4-to-1 ratio. So you take 4 trucks off the road for every 1 car that you move. And so just by default, in order to really be able to leverage rail, you have to be moving a decent amount of volume to justify using rail. And then you also have to be moving at least over 400, 600 miles for the economics to justify moving by rail. So those are your kind of 2 qualifiers when you're a shipper and you're thinking about it. Am I doing long hauls, which really sort of lends itself to rail? And then also how much volume I'm moving rail? Because, to move something very small, the idea of less than container load, it just can be very expensive. And the more volume you move, the longer the distance it is, the more in the money it is for you to move freight by rail. And at the end of the day, really I thought, and this is something, I saw down the road, and it actually is something that has become much more sort of accelerated within the shipper freight space, is ESG goals and environmental sustainability mandates that companies are either voluntarily doing, or if they're in a state that has a compliance program, or if they're in Europe where there's a compliance program, they have a certain targets that they have to meet sort of by mandate. So one of the fastest ways, or one of the quickest ways to be able to minimize your carbon footprint is to take some trucks off the road and put them onto intermodal, or take trucks off the roads and put them onto flatbeds, or put them into liquid trucks. So there are some real tailwinds that rail has, and some real environmental benefits to moving by rail.
And so when we think about, sort of the role that rail plays in just the overall transportation ecosystem, is it still sort of and maybe you don't have the answer to this, but I'm just thinking out loud here. Is it still, are most rail companies operating independently, or are they operating as the department in the back of the building, like at a 3PL that I was working at? How are, I guess sort of most rail companies structured who are handling the shipment side of things? So the broker of rail.
I think it's probably very similar. They probably have an intermodal group or an intermodal expert that's sitting, hopefully not in the very back of the building. Hopefully they have a window and at least a water cooler next to you drink water. But I think what's happening now, and maybe this is a shift when you were seeing this, is rail is becoming a lot more integrated into the overall supply chain strategy for shippers. So it behooves brokers, 3PLs, and any intermediary to be able to have somebody on the desk that understands the interplay between trucks and rail. So there's kind of 2 parts of this. So there's the intermediary side of the business, where they're effectively doing the analysis for their shippers. Should they be moving by rail, or should they be moving by truck? And then on the other side of that is the actual shippers themselves that are managing the movement of their own freight and have their own in-house logistics group. And historically, that has been managed or insourced in-house. So if you're a shipper and you're moving anything of kind of somewhat of significant volume, and it's an important core part of your overall supply chain, you're typically going to hire somebody to do that for you in-house, whether it be a group of 1 or a group of 10 or a group of 20, depending on how much volume you move. Now, what's happening there is there's a trend that we're really starting to see that's changing, is a lot of these companies that are doing that are now really sort of taking a hard look to outsourcing their rail logistics to a third party. So we launched a rail logistics part of our business about a year ago. And then we just announced a partnership with RailLink at the end of last year, which is owned by the 7 Class 1 railroads, to be able to help manage the physical logistics for their shippers. But the reason why we did that was because a lot of the shippers that were coming into our platform were asking if we could just manage their loads for them. They would come in, put a transfer request in, and as soon as we said, do you have a rail rate? Do you have rail cars? All the pertinent sort of basic one-on-one questions that move by rail, you just see this like glaze over their face that says, what are all those things that you're asking me to do? Oh, and I need to get credit in place with the railroads, and they may not accept my credit. So there were all these different sort of hurdles that shippers had to jump over. And that was the reason why we jumped into the physical logistics part of the business, because I think that the trend is moving in the direction where you're going to see a lot more outsourcing of rail. And I think eventually, the folks that have been relegated to the back of the house, may have an oceanfront view window someday because of the big move to rail.
It's so since with 2020, I mean, obviously, it just threw a wrench, I think, into everybody's supply chain plans, and it's been just sort of this back and forth pendulum swing that's been going on, especially when it comes to rates and fuel prices and things like that. Are those same pendulum swings going on in rail too?
The pendulum swings don't typically happen to that degree, like what you see in ocean freight, for example.
Hmm.
You don't see a $20,000 container one day, and the next year it's at $1,200 or $1,000. You have 7 Class 1 railroads. You have 2 in the east, you have 2 in the west, 2 in Canada, and then you had one in the middle, which is Kansas City Southern, but that is now merging with Canadian Pacific. Now you're going to have 6 Class 1 railroads. So you don't have this competitive landscape like you do in ocean. Yeah, they're the larger carriers in ocean, but they're also smaller to mid-sized carriers, and there's all these different ways that intermediaries can participate in that market, which can create more volatility in the price swings. With rail, it's on a track and it's controlled by two or 2 on the west or 2 on the east, and so because you have very limited competition on the Class 1 railroad side, rates are very steady and they're very consistent. So you don't see that type of volatility like you do even in trucking, for example, because again, trucking, very open, very competitive market. It's not a closed market. You can switch, with no problem to any carrier you want at any time you want. Once you're served by a rail carrier, it's very difficult to rip out or find another location that's served by the competing carrier unless you're dual served by both carriers on that side of the country. So because of that, there's a lot more of a standardized framework for how pricing rail works. And on the carload side of the business, every commodity, every lane is priced differently, versus intermodal, where a lot of the wholesale rates are going to the IMCs, and the IMCs are providing the rates ultimately to the shippers. But because of the nature of how carload business and commodities work, it's not as cookie cutter, because every commodity has a different weight, has a different handling requirement, has a different level of expertise that's needed because of it being hazardous or not hazardous. And then every lane's different, right? You have to manage the lanes differently because of certain products are moving more in one quarter versus the other quarter. So network optimization is extremely important for the efficiency of rail.
So, how unrealistic would it be for me to say I want to start up my own rail line? Like you mentioned that there's only 6 that are going to be within the country, and I imagine that barrier of entry is probably pretty challenging. Is there any use case for someone to say, like me, like, oh, I'm going to start up the next CSX? Does that exist, or is this just not a viable
No.
solution?
Yeah, so Class 1 railroads, no, I don't think another Class 1 railroad is going to be created in our lifetime. Now, as far as the Class 2 and Class 3 railroads, those are short line railroads. So those are, think of the Class 1 railroads, they control the highways, and then the short line railroads control sort of the off ramps and the side streets and all the interconnectors. So as far as short line railroads are concerned, absolutely, you can go acquire a short line railroad. You can build up the track in an area where there may not be track that exists, but not for Class 1 railroads. I mean, Class 1 railroad, that system is pretty much established and is a very sort of already sort of fundamentally structured network that is not going to change. Now, where the short line railroads really sort of help out with the rail system is if there are certain areas that may historically not had a lot of rail traffic, but there's a new car manufacturing plant or a new smelter that's coming in or a new sawmill that's coming in, and there's a lot of traffic in that line. There provides some justification for either a short line railroad nearby to be able to expand their track over to be able to service this business because their facility is going to be put on it, or for even a short line railroad to be created. But there's less than 600 short line railroads across North America. So even in the context of your Class 2 and Class 3 railroads, it's not like there's a very low barrier to entry. And if you wanted to start one tomorrow, you can go raise some capital, throw some track on the ground, hire a full operation folks, get a locomotive, and you're off to the races. There's a lot of regulatory issues, there's a lot of operational issues, there's a lot of considerations that need to be taking place, because the way the class and railroad manages their network will be a very, very important component as to how your short line railroad will sort of effectively optimize around the network.
I want to go back to your platform for a minute, Commtrex, and you had mentioned earlier that you have these sort of educational, like 101 videos for maybe shippers that are coming to the platform and they're looking to learn more about rail. What are some of those, I guess, sort of entry level questions or maybe topics that you cover with some of the 101s that you're providing within the platform?
So when we created the resource center, which is where all of our information is housed, actually it initially spurred from the idea of creating a rail newsletter. So we created our first newsletter about 5 years ago, and the newsletter was a very simple sort of mechanism for us to be able to take the analytics from our system, take the folks that we know in rail to be able to speak to topics, and then get it out to the rail industry, rail community, which started out with 500 folks, and now we have over 10,000 supply chain professionals that are on our network. So what happened was we started putting out. We never had any journalists. This is all sort of effectively our own proprietary data or information, or we were leveraging the experts within our ecosystem to speak to it. But very consistently, a lot of shippers were asking for certain types of information on how to move by rail, and they were in specific buckets that range from leasing rail cars. How does leasing a rail car work? Do I have to get into a long-term lease? What are the different things I need to think about when I'm leasing cars? To transloading. If I've never ever moved freight by rail and I'm not going to put a spur in my facility, how does transloading work? So what we did is we created these 101s sponsored by companies like CSX Transload, who sponsors our transloading 101. But the idea there is we want to go to the experts in these respective topics and have them talk to our sort of membership base about the basics and the nuts and bolts of rail. So we have a category for transloading, which is really the mechanism for anybody that wants to ship by rail that doesn't have a rail spur in the facility. Transloading provides that flexibility, or is that mechanism for them to be able to use it. Transloading, there's industrial development. If you're a shipper and you're thinking about creating your own distribution center, your own facility, what are all the things that go into that consideration? We have insurance. Insurance is a very important part of the business. And what are the basic types of insurance coverages that you need to be concerned about when moving freight by rail? All the way down to Rail 101 basics. How does the railroad system work? How does the railroad system work in the U.S.? And then we created a Shipping by Mexico Rail 101 sponsored by Kansas City Southern. And if I wanted to ship freight from Mexico or to Mexico, there's a lot more considerations that have to be sort of thought about. And none of these things are obvious. It's not like there was ever one place that was kind of a centralized repository for all this information. So all we were trying to do was take all these disparate pieces of information, put them into one sort of area, and then let people be able to consume that information on their own. And a lot of shippers tell us that when they have new hires come into their business, the very first thing they do is they send them to Commtrex 101s, because they're like, well, why should I sit here and try to train you on the basics? Go to these 101s because there's videos, and these are actual companies that are doing this day to day that are teaching this. And the other thing that we created was Ask the Experts, which is we take folks that are experts in this and have them speak to real live topics that shippers care about.
Well, you mentioned a couple things that I kind of want to go off on discussion points with. So what's the difference between shipping rail in the U.S. versus shipping rail in Mexico?
Shipping rail in the U.S. is going to effectively, depending upon what part of the country you're moving in, you have different options. Really, shipping rail in Mexico, you have Kansas City Southern and Ferromex. And those are your two largest sort of railroads that move product there. The regulations are very different. You're talking about Mexico regulations versus U.S. regulations. Even in Canada, regulations are different depending upon the type of product that you're moving. There's a lot more issues related to customs. So you have to have a customs broker involved in your move and understand what type of manifest and what type of paperwork is needed in order to move. I think you're subject to a lot more variability in the type of regulations that you're exposed to in Mexico. The whim of the government, they could sort of put an embargo in place, so they could, create a new tariff that wasn't expected. All of a sudden, traffic could stop until a political issue or regulatory issue is worked out. And there's a lot of value to shipping in Mexico just because, or shipping out of Mexico just because the economics around sort of building or developing or producing things in Mexico is highly favorable relative to other parts of North America. And I think shipping by Mexico is something that if you're looking to build certain products, or if you're in automotive or certain industries, it absolutely makes sense to have to be there. So when I'm thinking about shipping Mexico versus U.S., I'm thinking typically when a shipper asks me about that, my first response to them is, you should definitely talk to somebody at the railroad who has expertise in this. We can teach you through the one with the very basis of it, but very quickly, before you start leasing tank cars, before you start getting arrangements in place to move the cars, I think it's very important to understand what all the potential outlier events that could happen that potentially could, impede the smooth flow of your product in and out of Mexico.
So I think for a lot of folks, especially on the truckload side of things, like for me, you're loosely familiar with the customs process for truckload freight. Is it very similar to rail on I guess inspections and things like that, as far as like what's crossing the border on a rail line?
Yeah, I can't speak to how similar it is because I don't know the trucking side as well, but it is a very highly regulated market, and depending upon the product you're moving. So if you're moving hazmat products, there are definitely going to be a high level of scrutiny when you're crossing the border, and that's no different than going from U.S. to Canada as well. But customs process is the customs process, so I wouldn't think that there'd be that much variation in the process. I think at any level, I would think it really sort of depends upon what product you're moving, and then who you have sort of facilitating the move for you. So if you're a 3PL or a broker and you're very experienced, it probably for a shipper it probably makes no difference whether you're moving product from Guadalajara or Mexico City to U.S. or you're moving from Chicago to Newark, New Jersey. But if you're a shipper and you're trying to do it yourself and you're trying to manage that entire sort of move and find a translator in Mexico, get a rail rate with a railroad in Mexico, then figure out what to do once it gets to the border. What if it gets stuck at the border and you can't get those cars? What if the lease that you have for the rail cars doesn't permit you to take those cars into Mexico? Not every lessor wants their cars to be taken over the border to Mexico, because sometimes rail cars do get lost, and if it's stranded in Mexico, much harder to be able to go find your car in Mexico than be able to go find your car in South Carolina.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking there's a show on National Geographic that I love, To Catch a Smuggler, and they're always at those sort of border towns, and they'll pull. I mean, if they suspect a truck, they just make it pull over to the side of the road. They get the dogs out, and they're checking for any kind of drugs or like antiquities or things like that. So that would be, I don't want to say funny, but that would be super fascinating if that was going on the rail side of things. Like, hey, we got to unscrew this cart and push it over here, and then this one's over here, and you got the dogs running up and down it. I don't know if that exists, but it would be pretty crazy if it does.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be that's going to be a growing trend. You're going to see a lot more products coming out of Mexico coming into U.S. and Canada. I think the reason you're going to see that sort of area of the freight market grow is because of all the nearshoring or onshoring that's happening. So a lot of companies are moving a lot of their manufacturing facilities to Mexico, moving away from different places in Asia. And as that grows, they're going to need to figure out a way to be able to very economically and efficiently move that product from Mexico to the U.S. or to Canada. And if they're moving at any sort of distance or volume, rails can be the cheapest way for them to do that.
And so you had mentioned something else about, transloading and how transloading can create more flexibility in the supply chain overall. For folks who don't know what transloading is, can you kind of break down what that is from like, I guess, a fifth grade level, and then why you think it's the future of supply chain?
Absolutely. So very simply, transloading is the movement of goods from one mode of transportation to another. So it's going from rail to truck, truck to rail, barge to rail, ocean freight over to truck. So it's anytime you're having a product or a good that's moving from one mode of transportation to another. So the reason why it's so important is because think about how many different touches there are in a move from first mile all the way to last mile. How many different people have to touch that particular product, and how many moves are happening just on one mode of transportation. Typically, if you look at any product, it's probably, depending upon where definitely if it's coming internationally, obviously it's coming by water. So that's one mode. And you have to transfer that container or that good from freight to either a truck or rail. So just anything being imported into North America by default or definition has to be transloaded into North America. And then within North America, the way you create flexibility within your supply chain is to diversify your modes of transportation. So if you're 100% truck today, and you want to be able to create some diversification in your supply chain sort of strategy, one of the ways to do that, whether it be for ESG reasons, whether it be for economic reasons, whether it be just to minimize your exposure to one mode of transportation, if you're not going to build a spur into your facility, if you're going to, transloading is the only option, because the goal is to be able to get your products as closest to your customer as possible via rail, and so that you can have a very short haul for that last mile piece of the move. And right now, what I'm seeing a lot from shippers, or what we're seeing a lot from shippers are really rethinking their strategy as far as transloading is concerned, because what happened with COVID was they had maybe one major DC on the east, maybe one major DC on the west, and then all of a sudden all this capacity constraints happened and congestion happened, and the rates were moving up, and they couldn't keep up with all the dynamic changes that were happening. Rail is less volatile, as I explained earlier, and it's very steady. The volumes are fixed. So, if you have a portion of your supply chain dedicated to rail, I would say that could be, a way to be able to mitigate some of this exposure to this high volatility sort of pricing, or high volatility of exposure to not being able to even move your load. Because, during COVID, I had a lot of shippers that were calling us saying, hey, my carrier is canceling loads on me because I don't want to pay another 25, 30%. And I'm wondering, can I move this freight by rail instead? Because, I don't have any local carriers that are willing to pick up my loads. And I think, there's a rail spur that's, down the street from my facility. Can I use that? So in that instance where they don't have a facility served by rail, the only way they can move by rail is through transloading. So they got to find a transload facility, truck it to there, and then put the product on rail, and then move it to wherever the end is.
And when you're saying rail spur, that just means almost like it's just coming off of the main line, going directly to a warehouse or to another facility, correct?
That's exactly right. So a rail served facility. That's exactly right.
And so with, a lot of the things that you were just talking about with transloading, it almost sounds just like a completely new perspective for how these businesses, how these shippers are going to be tackling their future supply chain, not only like ESG goals, but also just shipping goals overall. Is that sort of I guess, the future of what rail logistics is going to look like?
I truly believe so. And I was at TPM last week, and during TPM, I spoke to several big box retailers, and many of them were really sort of interested in trying to integrate a transload strategy into their current supply chain. They never really thought about it until COVID hit, but now the C-suite at all of these companies are saying, how are you rethinking the supply chain strategy that we currently have? What are you doing? Whether the catalyst is to save money and cut costs, whether the catalyst is diversify exposure, whether the catalyst is to really sort of figure out how they can get to new markets or to new customers that they haven't before in a cheaper way. Transloading is really what's the mechanism that people are sort of, okay, well, I've never really done that before. I've done 100% of my moves to truck. Transloading is the only mechanism that you can do it. And if you think about the railroads, and they're in growing their footprint and growing their traffic, is right now a very important objective for all the railroads is to figure out how they can convert more truck lanes to rail lanes. How do they grow that? Is they grow that through transloading. Think of it, the way I like to visualize it, think of it as nodes in a network. Think about like an airlines. The more sort of regional airports that an airline can service, the more passengers they can service, the more markets they can have access to. The exact same analogy as the airlines. You're putting more regional sort of data points or nodes in the network so that more customers can be served by rail.
And it sounds like, with all of this, you mentioned the phrase earlier, skating to where the puck is going. It sounds like you've really positioned, with all of these things that are going on within the market and where the market seems to be shifting to. It sounds like you've positioned your company, Commtrex, into kind of a perfect position to be not only the data source provider, but the solution provider and the information provider.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, because it's at certain times during the journey, it certainly sort of questioned myself whether it would, going this direction was the right move or going this direction was the right move. And I knew that we were onto something with transloading, and the reason why we even started transloading is because transloading was built in within our services directory, and our data scientists were looking at all the data, and he said, well, what is this transloading thing that is getting 2.5 times more views, more searches, more inquiries than anything else in our platform? And then as soon as you started digging into it and started talking to shippers and transloaders and terminals and ports and railroads, you started really figuring out how important this component of the supply chain is, to the overall sort of consistent move or flow of goods. So that was a huge indicator to us, and that's why we created a standalone marketplace for it. And then the other indicator that I think was very bullish for us was that we were able to partner with all 7 Class 1 railroads. So all 7 Class 1 railroads put their terminals or their transloaders on our sort of our transload marketplace, so that they can create more visibility for shippers to be able to find their sites and create more way for them to connect with the railroads and with the shippers in those certain markets. So, to the extent that, I could say I had a really good crystal ball, but my crystal ball was really data analytics and a lot of conversations with shippers and a lot of conversations with terminals and railroads. And, historically, translators really sort of didn't even really have commercial teams. They really sort of were a fairly small team. They're operating themselves. And then once they're full, they really never were marketing themselves out to the market. So it was very difficult. There was no easy way to find translators. So, once we built the platform, we saw how much traffic we were getting, 3-4 years ago, even pre-COVID, I knew we were onto something special.
Yeah, I mean, you put it extremely well, and this has been a really valuable discussion. Tons of insight, and I know for some listeners, and maybe some folks out there, you're probably wondering, like, oh, there's all this stuff going on with East Palestine, Norfolk Southern, all of these things that are going on safety wise, which is obviously very horrifying. But that is more for a discussion on experts from the operational side of things, from the safety side of things. Neither of us are experts in that regard, so I kind of just wanted to point to the elephant in the room of, yes, we want to have these discussions, but it's probably best for another episode, another podcast, for somebody who is definitely more focused in the operational safety aspect side of things. So for those listeners, I will get to that very soon. I'm currently scoping out, visitors for that. But for the sake of this discussion, this is more on the tech side of things and how this historic really mode of transportation has really evolved, and how your company is helping to evolve it into the 21st century with, especially on the data and analytics side of things, which just seems to permeate through all modes of transportation within the industry. And it's creating a lot of different discussion points. And you've actually been privy to some of these different discussions. You mentioned that you had moderated a panel at Manifest the Future of Logistics. That's actually where we met. And this discussion is happening because that's where we met. So give me a little bit of insight. You've been to a couple other conferences before, after Manifest. So give me sort of, I guess, the sense or the overall temperature in the water of how the rest of transportation is reacting to rail as it kind of comes into this new era.
There's a few points on that. At Manifest, and probably most of the conferences I go to, there are very few people who understand rail. I think at Manifest, I was probably one of less than a handful of companies that were rail technology focused.
Wow.
At the conference, and this was Manifest was a supply chain technology conference. I probably would say it's probably the same for TPM Tech, or even at TPM when I was there. I didn't see the railroads were there. There were a lot of 3PLs and IMCs that were there, but as far as just companies that are, I wouldn't say exclusively, but were primarily focused on rail technology, there just wasn't a lot of presence there. So, I think issue one is just awareness. I think just being able to understand, oh, this other side of the world, rail, is something that I could be utilizing for my supply chain. How does that work? Because trucking and ocean freight are extremely different than rail. I mean, you couldn't get more of an antithesis. Very close network. It's on a track. There's a small amount of people or small amount of players that are managing your freight. It's very specialized in some sense, depending upon if you're on the carload side or the intermodal side. But what I'm hearing a lot of is how can I move from 100% exclusive just truck to figuring out what part of my supply chain makes sense for rail.
Hmm.
And the question I get a lot of times is, when I call up a railroad and I want a support, I don't always get somebody to call me back, or it's very difficult sometimes for people to explain. And it's for good reason, because if you're a smaller shipper, rail is more conducive for people who are moving long distances with higher volume. So if you're a smaller volume shipper, it may not make sense for you to have one or two carloads moving manifest. Now, with that said, maybe it does make sense, versus the rates that you're getting on the trucking side. So the education component to rail is something that I think a lot of people that want to move into this space are missing.
Hmm.
It's how can they get more educated on it? Because if you're a supply chain manager or you're a transportation procurement manager and you're making the case to your C-suite or to your management that they should move by rail, and they're starting to ask you very granular questions about how everything works and the processes, and probably most importantly, what are the risk factors that I need to be concerned with if I'm now going from truck to rail? You are effectively kind of putting your name on the line with the company to move this to this mode. So you want to make sure that you fully understand all the different dynamics of it. And I think once people understand the dynamics of it and they have the structure down, I think people get very comfortable with moving by rail because it's a very safe, I think it's a very environmentally friendly mode of transportation, and it's a very consistent mode of transportation. It's very, very consistent. You have products that are going to move, and there's there's a lot of things that happen sort of weather wise or climate wise, or there's obviously derailments that happen, but those are very few and far between. For the most part, the rail network is moved very consistently, very smoothly. So for shippers that want consistent large volumes that are moving sort of long distances, I think rail is a good option. I think most people right now are trying to figure out, do I do that myself? Do I outsource that to a third-party logistics company? Do I do a test shipment here and there? Because at the end of the day, for everybody, on your, listening to your podcast and everyone that we work with, it's all about the delivered cost, right? And, what is the cheapest delivered cost to get my freight from origin to destination is the big question. And, if you're not taking a hard look at rail, I think you're probably not doing justice to your company, because there are really only two ways to move things on land, and it's rail and truck. And if you're ignoring one of the two, you really are missing out on something that potentially could be of value to your shipment sort of strategy.
On the truckload side of things, there's all kinds of news, about autonomous and automation and AI. You had mentioned that you were maybe one of maybe five at, rail technology companies at these conferences. Is any kind of like automation, AI, autonomous, like is any of that going on in rail?
Yes, there are folks that are testing out AI at different layers of the supply chain. So folks are testing AI out on the safety maintenance side of the business. They're testing it with being able to inspect rail cars, inspect locomotives. We are using AI. We are right now sort of testing out AI to be able to point out different congestion points within the network to be able to help shippers identify ways they could be optimizing their rail moves more. We collect a lot of supply and demand data. And because this is all sort of proprietary data sets to us that no one else has, we take that data along with other data sets. We're trying to layer AI on top of that to effectively create a co-pilot for shippers that can help them, help them make decisions when they're struggling with, should I move in this direction, that direction? Should I even move at all? There are enough inputs that can be collected to help someone make a higher probable decision that's going to point them in one direction or other. But I think AI is something that's going to be table stakes for not just folks in rail, but for every industry within the next 1 to 3 years, probably sooner than later. Particularly now that you have technologies out there that are effectively, very easy to use type of technologies like your chat GBT type technology, which people
That was going to be my next question.
that is a technology that people are going to use, right? That's your co-pilot, right? And that's going to change the way search is done. It's going to change the way queries are made. So AI is definitely being looked at. And as far as autonomous, really, you just have a locomotive that's moving, anywhere from, 30, 40, all the way up to 130, 140 cars. There's two conductors that sit in the train. And do I ever think that they're going to be autonomous? Probably not. You're always probably going to need humans in locomotives, and to be able to manage the shipments. And really, that's around safety reasons, right? It's really, you can probably trust technology with autonomous trucks for probably shorter haul moves, maybe even longer haul moves at some point when the infrastructure is there across the U.S. But if you're talking very short standard moves on trucks, probably great and very safe. Rails on a track, so in theory, could it be used potentially? But I think the freight that's being moved is at such high volume, and as we've seen in other derailments, there's so much potential outlier events to happen that I think you're always going to have humans that are involved with locomotives and moving shipments by rail.
100%. And I think you had touched on it a little bit with like the chat GPT sort of information era that we've entered into. Do you see any kind of technology in rail specifically that is utilizing like a language model like a chat GPT?
And not to talk my book here, but I mean, we are trying to effectively create the database, the repository for all information needed, be able to move freight by rail. So, could I foresee a day where somebody comes into our system and has, kind of a auto co-pilot that will help them answer all these questions, using the natural language queries, vis-a-vis or a type of GPT? Absolutely. I think that every industry, not just transportation, if they're going to stay competitive, they're going to have to think through, what am I going to need to do to stay competitive? What am I going to need to do to make things easier? And at the end of the day, when you think about Chat GPT or any, of these other AI extensions or tools that are, have a similar concept, which right now I feel like there's hundreds of them that are being released every month around AI. I truly think that it's going to get to a point to where there's so many data points and so many inputs, and there's so much information that can be all sort of combined into, one sort of database, that, humans, if they don't have the ability to lean on that type of technology or that type of sort of lever, the folks that are using that as a lever are going to have an edge competition wise, because of that, not having the technology, because everyone's going to need to be on an even playing field. So right now, it's such a nascent product. Probably very few people have ever used it. But come 2-3 years from now, we're sitting on this podcast and we're talking to each other. I think it's going to be as common as people refer to as Google, for searching.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that's where the data set or in your own proprietary data really will come into play in order to almost put like a chat GPT like system on steroids. So it's I've heard it said from like a marketing standpoint, marketing software and things like that, that if you don't have or not planning some kind of an AI component into your current SaaS product, then you're probably going to be dead on arrival within just a few years, because that's how rapidly all of this tech is evolving. So it's kind of cool to see that you guys are already thinking about it on the rail side of things, especially for an industry that is, such I think a historical place in this country and really across the world. So, as we kind of wrap up this interview, or is there anything else going on in rail that you feel like the audience should be aware of or pay attention to?
I think just overall, I think rail is trying to be a more sort of customer friendly, or shipper friendly sort of mode of transportation, through partnering with companies like Commtrex to be able to proliferate information and educational sort of resources through our platform, or through putting their locations, their rail serve locations, on a system like us. I think everybody that's in the railroad industry can agree that we need to make things much more simplified and easier, so that you don't have to be an expert to move by rail. I think, not only our system, but there are other companies out there that are trying to figure out ways to make that easier. So that's number one. And the second point, I think overall is, really, the sustainability story. I think that is a huge tailwind for rail today. And then moving into the future, I think, if anybody is really trying to set either voluntary or they have to meet compliance mandates for their carbon emissions targets, rail has to be a part of the conversation. So anybody who's thinking about sustainability, whether it be because it's in front of me and I'm just kind of getting trying to get familiar with it, or because I've been asked by the C-suite to put together a game plan. I think rail, and this is probably for your audience as well, I think more people are going to try to figure out how to convert more of their truckloads to intermodal loads just to be able to reduce their carbon footprint. There are some major 3PLs and 4PLs that have already came out in the news and said, by certain dates, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions footprint. And how we're going to do that is we're going to convert X amount of truckloads over to intermodal loads. And I think I think you're going to see a bigger trend of that, of people trying to figure out how they can grow that footprint via rail.
Very well said. And I just want to kind of, as I was thinking, and as you were talking, I was thinking, back to like cartoons and like Looney Tunes or something for that example, that when you see a typical like rail on or a train within a cartoon, it's like the cartoon character is taking coal and shoveling it into the oven of the train. Is that what fuel powers a train? I know I'm just going to end the interview with one more fifth grade level question.
Yeah, diesel. Diesel's the primary fuel, so it's
okay.
That's not. I mean, people are looking at ways to be able to fuel it more sustainable sources. They're testing out electric locomotives, hydrogen locomotives. Wow. Natural gas, NGL sort of driven locomotives. I mean, I think the railroads have a real sort of impetus to be able to try to figure out how they can create a more sustainable way to move freight, even just through creating technologies that will, effectively reduce emissions while a train is idle. So the engine is running when a train is idle. So there's different ways that there's technologies that are being developed that can, effectively reduce the carbon emissions while trains are idle. But yeah, good old gasoline is the way that these locomotives are.
So it's not like a Bugs Bunny that's set up, in every rail line all over the country, just shoveling coal into the train. That's good to know.
I've seen maybe in some part of North America, there's somebody that's shoveling coal into a train, but no, not at any level of scale.
All right, Martin. Well, as I end this interview with some of the smarter questions, sarcastically speaking, of course, where can folks, if they want to learn more about Commtrex, if they want to, maybe experience some of the 101s that you have within your platform, where can folks follow more of your work, follow Commtrex, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so you can go to commtrex.com. That's COMMTREX.com. There you'll find our marketplaces, you'll find our resources center, you'll find all the data information, the 101s. You can find me personally on Twitter at LEW_Martin, or follow us on LinkedIn. We'd love to have more people sort of subscribe to our platform, because we're always pushing out proprietary information and data and insights from the industry. So I think even if you aren't moving by rail or have no plans to move by rail, just having exposure to rail, I think could be, just obviously up your game as far as being a supply chain professional.
100%. And I actually just wrote, if you heard me typing, I should just wrote a note to include a link to your newsletter in the podcast show notes. So if you're listening to the podcast, I will make sure that I add all of those links to Commtrex, to your Twitter, and then also to the newsletter that you have that goes out to, I think, more than 10,000 subscribers is what you mentioned. So we'll include all of those resources in the show notes, just to make it easy for folks if they want to get more educated on how to move their freight on rail. So Martin, thank you so much for sharing your insight. This was a super fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Blythe. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience for listening to us, and I look forward to working with you more. Thank you.
Absolutely.